This is our special series of episodes called the 1950 Census Weekly Update, and this is week 3. So let me just give you a quick view of the map so that you know where we are at. We, of course, released several states in the first couple of weeks and territories, and this week we are releasing fully indexed and searchable South Dakota, Rhode Island, and what are called the overseas territories, which include Wake Island, Midway Island, and Canton Island. Coming next week are going to be the Indian Reservation Schedules, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute with our special guest for the day. Now, just a reminder, all images are available for the 1950 census on Ancestry. Those are accessible through the Census District Finder map. You type in the name of the town where your family lived or the address where they lived. You'll be taken to the set of images for that enumeration district. Ancestry has completed the indexing through the handwriting recognition process of the entire 1950 census and has delivered that to Family Search, where volunteers like hopefully you and me are reviewing those records. As those are completed and delivered back to Ancestry, that's how we are publishing the records. So one of the questions I keep getting asked is, what states are coming next? Well, the states that are coming next are dependent upon you and me and what we choose to review over at familysearch.org/1950 census. So that's the update on what has been completed this week. We do have a special guest today for a few minutes. We're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to go ahead and bring her on camera as I'm introducing her. Some of you may know Nicka Sewell-Smith. Hello.
Hello.
Besides being a family history colleague for years ago, Nikka and I discovered through DNA that we are also actually cousins, and her brilliant research led to that connection, and we figured that out. And so I not only love her as a colleague, I love her as a family member, and am super excited to see all the great work that Nikka does in the family history community. Nikka, I will let you talk about that later. First, I want to talk about how excited you are about the 1950 census.
Well, I think the thing that's really cool about this release, because I was around for 40, is I think folks are way more engaged on social media with it. So it's not just like, when we go back in the annals of time, when 60 is coming out, we won't be like grasping at like, well, what were we talking about? Or what were we doing? Like, we actually have a really, really great, archive of ourselves talking about it and interacting with it. And so I have been steeped in 50 as everyone else. I think we all tried to absorb as much as we could in terms of preparation. And then now it's here. And so I'm excited. One of the things that I loved, and it also became sort of a contest, was finding my mom or my dad first. And it was hilarious because my mom almost made it she really made it like a contest. Like, did you find your dad before me? And I found my uncle, her brother, before her. So I actually did find my mom before my dad. And it was great just to see her and like to see my grandmother, the inspector at the at the soup company, which was, Campbell Soup.
Yeah. I love that. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about this census. So there are a couple of things that are different about this census. One is that we have a very specific Indian reservation schedule. Now, I wanted to talk to you about that because you, as some viewers may not know, are actually a registered member of, is it the Cherokee Nation?
Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Yep.
There you go. Okay. So tell me, have you had a chance to look at the blank form for the Indian reservation schedule, and what's your take on it?
Right. So Form P8, that is the Indian reservation schedule. And in order to have this conversation, of course, briefly, we have to talk about the fact that there were schedules before this one that include Native American groups. Most people don't know about them because they're hidden at the back. Just like these are hidden at the back. You just won't know unless you have ideas around or you've looked at the location, right? Was that a reservation? Was it the Indian Territory at one point? In particular, we can call out the 1900 census, in 1910, where you go to the end and you'll see specific questions that are, directed towards people who are in First Nations or Indigenous groups. So some of the questions that are asked in Form P8 for 1950 are very similar to what we saw in those Indian schedules before. Things like, the type of home, things like blood quantum, whether or not people, read and write and speak English. And some of this stuff is archaic. At the time it was not that. It is now. And even one of the questions that I thought was interesting was, did he or she participate in any Native Indian ceremonies? And in some ways, especially when you think about how we think about things differently now, right? We sort of assimilation was kind of the point in some instances for these questionnaires, was to kind of see whether or not people were, maintaining a connection to their heritage and their identity with regard to their First Nations or Indigenous group. And so, again, you're going to find Form P8. It's going to be sort of a separate enumeration. You're going to get the regular one that you get on 50, but at the end of the roll, or, at the end of the images, you're going to see a separate enumeration, homes with 10 persons, counted, and they'll be in Form P8.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that, and we've done this for several of the different territories, like the Panama Canal territory and some different things. They all have their own schedules. When these come online at Ancestry, hopefully next week, that's the plan, they'll be searchable just like any other record on Ancestry. And the interesting thing about these schedules is it asks for their name, but then it also asks, is there any other name that they're known by? And so in some instances, you may end up with some kind of an English name as well as an Indigenous name for this person, and they'll be searchable either way. Yeah.
Which is great, because sometimes we may not have, we might have lost that name through the process of assimilation. You may not know someone's name that they may have had. So I like the fact that it's available for both in terms of searching.
Yeah. Now, one thing I do just want to make sure people understand, these are, as I understand them, schedules of people who were living on reservation land. So if they lived on reservation land and they were enumerated, that doesn't mean that they are genetically Indigenous, right? There could be white people who were living on that land who were in some ways adopted in or married in. In your case, there are Black Americans who were living on Native land, and some of them are genetically Indigenous and some of them are not. So there's kind of a difference between those things that people need to understand. And then the second thing is, not all Indigenous people lived on reservation land. So just because they're not enumerated in an Indian population, that's the name of it, doesn't mean they're not Indigenous genetically or by tribal affiliation.
Right. And from what I've seen from the browsing that I've done in other areas, I was looking, I think in New Mexico, only the people who are marked Indian in terms of race will have a Form P8. I saw, a bunch of people who were marked white who were living in that same area in a reservation. Like literally it says blank, blank reservation, but they did not have a Form P8. So I would, you know what I mean? So that's also another kind of check, like, hey, again, just because they live there does not necessarily mean that they were connected to that particular group in terms of a familial tie, genetic tie, treaty tie, whatever it is. That's a good call out, especially when you're looking in places like Oklahoma, where, the eastern part of the state, and even other parts of the state were where reservations were. And then once the state became a state in 1907, then things start to get different. And then now we're back to where we were pre-1907. So
yeah. Okay. Thank you for helping us understand that a little bit better. Okay. The second thing I want to talk to you about has to do with African-American underreporting. And just for some context for that, for those viewers who don't understand, can you just explain briefly a little bit about the Great Migration?
Right. So the Great Migration really, I mean, depends on who you talk to. Historians have different dates, but really it sort of begins right after the Civil War, right? Folks are leaving the South en masse because they have the ability to do so, right? They're not restricted. And they're moving to, from the Deep South to areas along the Eastern Seaboard. You have folks coming, from states like Louisiana and Arkansas going up to places like Chicago, Detroit. And then, eventually you have folks going out west to California, Nevada, other places. And so 1950 is really kind of where you're hitting the peak of that movement. It continued all the way until the 70s. And so, from my experience, I had like 10 states I had to look for family in, and you're like, 10? Yes. I mean, you have to remember these families, they were working on farms. So it's like 10 people and they could go to 10 different places. And so, so it's not just the address. It's like, well, gosh, you're moving from this agrarian location where you only have like maybe 5 enumeration districts to like 100 plus. So it can become a challenge, but when you've got great tools like the district finder and other things, you can also find folks. The other thing is that as people moved into major cities, sometimes we see them not be enumerated, and there was an undercount of at least 2 million on 1940. And folks will always, that's been one of my biggest things that I've talked about since that release was don't always expect to find everyone on the census. I didn't find my dad, didn't find my aunt and sister, didn't find my grandparents. 1950, I'm having the same problem. So I'm hoping that that's not the case. They were in Chicago. They weren't in a small environment. So unfortunately, there has been historic undercounts. So you have to also qualify that. And that's the reason why you got to have additional documents, resources, collections that we look in to quantify that time for our ancestors. It's not an end all be all if they're not on the census. That just gives us that means we have our work cut out for us, and it also will sharpen our skills because we're not just focusing on one record set.
Yeah. I think we talked about this, or I talked about this last week just a little bit, but I do just want to talk about it in the context of this people moving that move into big cities, especially. So the census taker would take a pass through the neighborhood, and anybody who wasn't home, they would just mark not at home. Then on the second pass through the neighborhood, they would start renumbering the sheet numbers. 71, that's the second pass through the neighborhood. So it doesn't matter if the last page of the first pass was page 12 or page 27 or whatever. The next page would be sheet 71. And then they would go back to those houses that weren't at home, and they would write on the original pass that they were enumerated on sheet number 73, line number 4 through 9, right? So they would make a notation. And so then you have to go to those other sheets. So right now, while there's no searchable index, people are coming across this not at home quite a lot. But what I'm understanding from you in our discussion that we had to prepare for this was that in some cases, it just says not at home and there is no line number or sheet number. So
Right. I almost got not at home put on a t-shirt because it would be like, I'm like the entire page that I would be wondering, how we haze the enumerators. We just do. We complain like they're probably sitting wherever they are like, well, you guys stop complaining at me. But I've seen almost entire pages not at home. Yeah. But no reference to this, the page 70 and beyond. And so, it makes you wonder, when did they come around? Was it a particular night? Were people at church? You just wonder like where everybody was at. So yeah, I have seen the not at home phenomenon. I've seen a lot of that without a reference to a later page. And again, the areas I'm looking in are major metro areas. These are not little agrarian locations. Because we're, for the most part, we've moved out of those places because we're at the height of the Great Migration for this census. So I'm very interested to see, again, once we reach full indexing capacity, what that looks like. And I'm crossing my fingers. Just go ahead and send your thoughts into the atmosphere that my uncle and my aunt and my grandparents are not at home, please.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Before we send you off, first of all, thank you for spending some time with us today. You did have a really great tip, though, about neighbors' names. Tell us about that.
Right. So one of the things that I did when I finally found my mom, like she kept calling me on the hour, like, hey, have you found me yet? I actually started reading to her the neighbors that were in their building. And I was like, well, Mom, do you remember this man named Porter Whiteside? Like, and she, the minute she heard his name, she started telling me all of these stories about him and his wife. And she started listing off the names of their kids. And I'm looking at the live census form going, oh my gosh, it's like my mom's on the phone, so she doesn't see it. So, she just starts rattling kids' names off. She's telling me about the woman, his wife having all the kids in the apartment building and how all the kids knew and everyone knew when she was in labor because she was screaming and all these stories. And I just went household by household. So that's a great way to connect with folks. And here's the other thing. Let's say my mom didn't remember the address of where they lived, but she remembered the neighbors. You might want to search for the neighbors. We often do that, especially if we're trying to find a family from census to census and we don't know where they went. So we may take an older neighbor from 1930 and try to find them on 1940. Do that with the living people. If your parents or folks you're looking for remember those neighbors, try to find the neighbors. And if you recall enough names, and if you can get there, you might actually find your people. So that's something my mom helped me learn.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Nikka. Tell people where they can find you and receive more education from you.
Sure. So I'm here on YouTube. Who is Nicka Smith? You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Nicka Smith. And yeah. Oh, one last thing.
Yeah.
Know where your odd and even numbers are.
Oh, yeah.
Because that threw me off, right? The enumeration district finder is awesome. I'm still using it. I just have it open. But for some reason, a lot of people in my family lived on the even side of the street. So sometimes, even if you're still in the browsing stage before we get to, full indexing, just have an online map open where you can see where the odd and the even numbers are. And you might have to pivot to the district right across the way because that's where the even numbers fall. So that's another clue that I had identified.
You're brilliant. Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. I will talk to you later. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me again today. I will be back next Wednesday at the same time, same place with an update. Until then, you can go to ancestry.com/1950 census to access all of the tools that we've been talking about today. And if you've discovered something interesting or surprising or inspiring in the 1950 census so far, we would love to hear about it. Just make a quick 2-minute video on your mobile device telling us the story, and you can submit it at ancestrysubmissions.com/census. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.